Welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles, 24/8. I'm Allison.
And I'm Erica. And before we start, as always, be sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, or stream us on Spotify. And if you're enjoying BC the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
Yes, and also don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. And you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. Please do that.
And before we get to the meat of our episode, which is our Beatles book club, our third Beatles book club, we just want to make one quick announcement, a reminder to come see us next weekend. That's Friday and Saturday, September 20th and 21st, for Beatles at the Ridge, the fabulous Small Beatles Festival in Walnut Ridge, Arkansas.
So excited. I can't believe it's next weekend.
I know. We've been talking about this forever. I can't wait.
It's so crazy. Yeah, so it's, as Erica said, it's going to happen Friday to Saturday, September 20th and 21st, 2019. If you're listening to this in the future, hi, I hope everything is okay. But there's a lot of musicians, artists, poets, authors, and lots of Beatles fans to hang out with. And we'll be doing a live podcast on Saturday at 4:30, right before the keynote. We're very excited. We'll be discussing Beatles memorabilia from a next-gen perspective.
Yes, and we'll have a fun special guest doing that with us. So hopefully we'll be able to put that on this feed if we get a recording of it. But if not, maybe if you're in the area, come on down to Beatles at the Ridge and see us live. We'll be talking to as many of the guests and attendees as possible, and we'll definitely report back with a recap and a bunch of fun new interviews. There are a lot of really interesting Beatles authors there, so we're going to hope to get some good stuff from them. Also, Allison and I will be together in person for the first time in like months. So
I know. When was the last? Was it November for the White Album symposium?
I think it was in February when we did a very non-Beatles trip to Harry Potter Universal.
That's right. That like 2 seconds you were out here in LA. Right. Anyways, but if you want to meet us in person and share this beautiful moment, the festival is the low price of nothing dollars. It's free.
With free parking, too, for those of you driving in.
Oh, that's so amazing. That's a phrase you never hear here in LA. But yeah, if you want to find out more, go to BeatlesAtTheRidge.com. And yeah, we hope to see you there. Anyway, like we said, this is our Beatles book club. And it started out as like an every month thing, but it's become a every so often thing.
Every so often.
Every so often, where we read a different book about the Beatles and invite you guys to listen along with us, and then we discuss it.
This time, we're going to be continuing on our Brian Epstein kick and reading a Cellarful of Noise by Brian Epstein.
That was what John Lennon liked to call it, a cellar full of boys, which is very John.
Yes.
First of all, this Brian Epstein kick we're on, it has got me just all sorts of happy. If you missed it, we posted a special mini-sode about how to pronounce Brian's last name, which is obviously Brian Epstein. And if that's not obvious to you, go listen to the episode.
And then we posted it again. We posted a second version of it where we found even more definitive evidence about the correct pronunciation of his name. So definitely check that out. And at us if you want to talk about it, because we love to talk about this.
So let's go into a little bit of background before we start talking about what's in A Cellarful of Noise. Strangely, this is Brian's autobiography, but it was published in 1964, which is so interesting. Brian wasn't even 30 at that point, and a lot of people consider this to be heavily ghostwritten by Derek Taylor, who was Brian's personal assistant then, but he later became a very well-known publicist for the Beatles, the Beach Boys, a lot of 60s artists. And the rumor was that Derek sort of wrote this whole thing. Brian sort of looked it over and gave it the check mark, and that was it. But actually, that's not the case.
What happened was Brian actually taped all of this speaking to Derek Taylor, and then Derek Taylor transcribed the book, wrote it up, which Brian then edited, proofread, and approved. The transcription is in Derek's book called 50 Years Adrift, which I think is out of print now.
Right? Oh, yeah. And it's like, I think you can find copies for it every once in a while for like $2,000. So if anybody's got that and wants to like scan those pages and send them to us, yeah, that'd be good. Also, if anybody can find those goddamn tapes, because that would just be amazing.
Oh my God.
Like, where are those tapes? They've got to still exist somewhere, right?
Mark, are you listening?
Mark. Mark Lewison,
That would be good for volume 2. This is right in the volume 2 wheelhouse, I think. So you
right?
found him.
Lewison, give me the tapes. So the point is, this is all really good news because Cellarful of Noise is essentially told in Brian's voice. It's not in Derek Taylor's voice.
And that makes sense to me because Derek Taylor wrote a bunch of copy for the Beatles. Like, he wrote the Beatles' first couple of Christmas records, and
Right.
you can definitely tell that those are not the Beatles' voices.
Yeah.
And they're making fun of it all the way.
Yeah. And plus, Derek Taylor was very involved in the 60s teen magazine world, which, if you come into the Ridge, I'm going to bring some of those that we can all look at and have fun with.
Yes.
But Derek Taylor ghost wrote a lot of this is how you date Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, what I look for in my ideal girl. Like, that was all Derek Taylor sort of pandering to the
That's
fans,
hilarious.
for real.
I'm glad that that was cleared up because this one really sounds to me like what I believe Brian sounds like from the interviews we had with Brian. So it makes me happy to know that this is probably much closer to an autobiography, if not a straight up autobiography just written from tapes, than a ghostwritten book.
I agree. I agree. And I've got to say, I've obviously read A Cellarful of Noise before, but I haven't read it in probably 10 years. And I really enjoyed this reading of it, like having, known that and obviously developed my love of Brian for a decade more or whatever. But yeah, it's like knowing Brian and having freshly listened to a lot of those interviews for our last episode. It was like I could clearly hear his voice saying all these words, and it was just delightful.
And what's really interesting to me reading this book was that at first I was like, okay, I've heard all these stories before. Okay. And I was kind of skimming. But then I went back and I was thinking, actually, this is the first time that anybody probably heard any of these stories. And the book feels so much more groundbreaking to me if you think about the restricted capsule that media was in those days and what a firsthand account of the Beatles' experience what kind of gift that would have been at that time.
And it reminded me too of our first book club book, which was Love Me Do, The Beatles' Progress, which was really the very first book about the Beatles. It painted them in such an honest light. And Brian actually does a pretty good job of that too. He's going to be a little bit more gracious to his boys, but he does get kind of honest, which is very, very cool of him to let his guard down enough to do that.
So the book uses the Beatles' first U.S. visit as a framing device to start off, which is probably a smart move because people open the book, they want to get right into the Beatles, less so than the autobiography of the person telling the story. So we start with the onset of Beatlemania. It was at a great time. I mean, he was at the top of this mountain looking down on this crazy, only 3 years that he had really had with the Beatles so far.
And who knows? I mean, I bet a lot of people reading this were sort of like, oh, yep, this is the end of the road, get big in America and go home. And in fact, this is just the beginning, as we all know now. I think it's interesting the way Brian sort of talks about the Beatles. He talks about his artistes. He explains why he calls them artists. But he always says my Beatles or us or we. He sort of defines them all as one solid unit. He's included every time. And I love when he talks about the Beatles being mobbed for autographs and pictures and stuff. He always includes himself. Like, we were being hounded for autographs and everyone wanted pictures with us. And I was like, yeah, I mean, did I time travel? Because I would be the one after Brian.
Yes, you would. And in that way, he coined himself the fifth Beatle, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he quite literally, on the cover of this book, I'm looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 Beatles on the cover. Middle is Brian. Anyway.
Well, Brian is your favorite Beatles, so.
Yeah, it's true. It's funny because at the time there was, the Brian Epstein fan club. There were people who were into him. I saw a photo on Instagram the other day, I think, of a fan photo with a girl and Brian, which I thought was really sweet. But I think a lot of people probably didn't know a whole lot about who he was behind the Beatles until his book came out. He's very honest about his early life, which was not amazing for him. He talks about how he was pretty much a failure until the Beatles came along, certainly until he started working at his father's store. He tried 1,000 different things, failed out of all of them, failed out of a bunch of different schools, left them, tried a bunch of different professions, dropped out. Like, he just really could not land. He calls himself in the book, quote unquote, one of the latest developers of all time. And he compares himself to Keats, which I thought was really interesting. And he says, if Keats had waited as long as I did to get going, he wouldn't have written more than a couple of poems before his death. which is kind of dark when you think that like Keats died at 25 and then Brian would die 3 years after this book was published at 32.
It gives another kind of perspective on the way we look at age now versus then, where, he's talking about himself as this old has-been, the oldest person to ever develop at like 22, 23, like when he was in drama school and everything. I mean, nowadays, if you're 22 or 23 and you haven't figured out what you want to do with your life, like join the club.
Yeah, you're a baby. Any 22, 23-year-olds, you are a baby. Do not worry.
Yeah.
We're older than you and we still don't know what we're doing.
Hell no.
Or most of the time. Yeah. So Brian, he's almost brutal to himself, which I think was a trait of his. But he says in school and in life, he was not popular and not good at forming friendships. So he adds that he's quote unquote probably better now because he's probably a nicer person. So, I mean, now as in 64, obviously, when the book was published.
Which is really sad in a way, because he's kind of saying bullying made me better and being an outcast made me better. He's got this sense of vulnerability that you certainly don't see in most popular media, especially at that time. And, he really reflects on himself and on his relationships. At one point in the book, he said, I wield a certain amount of what, for want of a better word, is described as power. This in turn brings other problems because it is no longer easy to know whether I am wanted for what I am or for what I am supposed to have in terms of material goods or power. In other words, do people want me or do they want the Beatles? That's sad.
Yeah, which I mean was really omnipresent. From 63 through the end of his life, like so many of his relationships, like his romantic relationships were built on that. And thinking of Diz Gillespie, which I don't think we really talked about Brian's relationship with that idiot very much. But, he was involved with a lot of users, a lot of people who really did just want that cachet. And I think that created a lot of insecurity. And I could see how that would fuel some of his self-abuse with drugs and some of his, shall we say, deviations.
Plus being an outcast and feeling like he never had a place in his life and being Jewish in a society where anti-Semitism was all over the place.
Yeah. And he's still hiding a massive secret, I mean, he doesn't talk at all in the book about being gay. In fact, we'll get into it in a little bit, but he says the opposite pretty much. And it's scary, I think, when you're not allowed to expose so much of yourself and who you are intrinsically, it becomes this whole thing where it doesn't create a stable foundation where you're like, oh, I know they like me because I'm a good person and I'm honest and blah, blah. And he was all of those things, but he was also not 100% true to himself.
Which he couldn't be. I mean, at the time, homosexuality, at least homosexual acts, were a felony. You could go to jail for that. So he had to hide it. But it's funny because he hides it and he doesn't, because he frequently uses words like unmanly to describe the way his parents thought of him. So he's not trying to be macho or anything. And he's not trying to, have to obscure that part of himself. He's just denying the part of himself that would get him in jail.
Exactly. It's sort of coded language, And I think, too, that's a really cool indicator of Brian's voice in the book, because Derek Taylor was kind of a ladies' man. He was sort of one of those macho, like, industry types who, like, slept around and, like, partied a lot. And so by using the tone, and the whole book is sort of theatrical and full of, like, certain bravado that's not over the top, but you can definitely feel the swell of pride from Brian. It's like that testifies to the tone of the book, which is great. He obviously talks about his family in the context of them sort of thinking he was unmanly, but he talks about Queenie, who he loved so much, his mother, Queenie Epstein. He says, still the loveliest woman I know, was intensely proud that her firstborn was a boy. And when, 21 months later, my brother Clive arrived, the Epsteins looked like being a happy and promising little family unit. Today, 30 years later, this is so again, but there were many intervening spans of misunderstanding, failure, and unhappiness before we found real contentment as a family. Very sad, when you think that Harry Epstein, Brian's father, would be dead 3 years later, and then Brian would follow suit like weeks after his father.
And whether the happiness that he is saying that he has now is totally true or not, we'll never know. Obviously, everybody has, everybody is not just one-dimensional in that way, but Brian obviously had a lot of inner demons that in this book he is trying very hard to deny.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, when you consider like the family dynamic, with them not only being a family unit, but also being a business entity, with Brian and Clive working at Harry's store and Brian sort of branching out and leaving his father, and then Clive, getting involved with NEMS later. And it's a whole big thing. Families are fucking complicated.
Mm-hmm. Not only did they have all of these issues with the business itself, but that Brian couldn't figure out who he was and what he wanted to do. And I think it probably wore on his parents, who expected him to follow a straight path, that he tried 4 or 5 different things and for one reason or another didn't succeed at them until
Oh my
he
gosh,
happened
right?
upon management and, well, really running the NEM store, but then managing the Beatles. I guess if he's 22 and that is old to be discovering yourself in 1960 Liverpool, and you're saying I want to go to an acting school, well, your parents are probably not thrilled about having to foot that bill.
Yeah, they probably didn't know what to do with him.
Yeah, and it was hard for him too, I'm sure, because every time he thought that he knew what he wanted to do, of course he had voices of doubt right there saying, well, we'll see if this one sticks.
One thing he does say in the book is he's very sort of pats himself on the back for saying he has an instinct for sound, which I think is pretty interesting because he was never one to really hang around the studio with the Beatles, but he does say he knows a hit when he hears it.
Well, he loved classical music and he had this really strong instinct for theatricality. I think those two things together, I think he even says it in the end that good music is good music and I know what it is. It didn't even matter whether or not the good music was his preference of music.
But that's interesting that for a guy who sort of has kind of a lack of instinct about what would work for him, he's like, I know this about myself. I'm sure that his confidence was bolstered because by that time, he had the Beatles and all that.
For sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, he has the success of having the top hit makers of all time.
exactly.
But before he discovered the Beatles, he did approach a few different professions. One of them was he was forced to go into the national service because he was one of the last generations that had to do that before it was abolished in the UK. And even though he seems to be somebody who deals with a lot of social anxiety and fumbles around and is insecure about himself, he also kind of gives zero fucks. Because he tells this story about how he got in huge trouble because he impersonated an officer and got caught doing it.
I love this story. This is that sweet baby in his element.
This is ridiculous. I guess I just read this because it's
read
absurd. It's absurd.
Read it.
He says, my failure to be selected as an officer did not, however, prevent me from impersonating officers, and one night this involved me in trouble. I had deviously secured a posting to Regent's Park Barracks, and I used to enjoy off-duty life in the West End, for I had a lot of relatives in London.
Sure, Brian.
Yeah, true story that. On, on this particular night, I had myself brought back to camp in a large car. It slid gently to a halt outside the barracks gate. I marched into camp wearing, rather pompously I'm afraid, a bowler, pinstripe suit, and over my arm an umbrella. Well, after that, he got in trouble, and he got ejected from the army for more than just being unsuitable, for just kind of being a prankster.
Yeah, which is so funny. It's so unlike the Brian that, was very regimented when it came to the Beatles. I love that. I love that story that he was like, yeah, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to get away with it. And then he didn't.
But even though he didn't, he's fucking proud of himself.
Yeah, because it's like that confidence. Like, that takes a lot of balls to do that.
Those stories kind of bridge the gap between this person who seemed, perpetually insecure and out of place, and this person who brought the Beatles to international stardom. He's got this innate sense of self-worth and self-confidence and fun, which you may not see, that really helped him probably not only gel with the Beatles, but have the confidence to approach all of these record companies and to be a pioneer in this field.
It's like these little flashes of the impish Brian. Like, I'm thinking about the photograph with the Beatles. I think it was taken in Paris when they're all around a dinner table with George and Judy Martin, and Brian's got like a chamber pot on his head. And it's like, that's so not the Brian you think of, but he could be a goofball.
Which is, I'm sure, part of the reason the Beatles gelled with him.
Yeah, he couldn't have been like totally L7.
No, John would have hated him, but he and John were very close.
Exactly. But Brian does say that, I love this quote, that he's not, quote unquote, not the vainest man in the world. That's a well-known DJ. And that's kind of like the pattern of this whole damn book, because Brian is like, he's super bitchy about other people, but he never names names. Like, it's sort of like, who are you talking about? Like, I suspect that well-known DJ might be Murray the K. I don't know. He and Murray had a good relationship, but Murray also seems like very vain.
Yeah, that's very possible.
Yeah, but I was like, oh, dude, like name names. He's like, he goes on at length about certain people, talks a whole bunch of shit, and then he's like, anyway, and sort of moves on.
And he also hates actors.
Oh my God, he hates
It's
actors.
so funny.
Holy shit. Yeah, which is so funny because he, forced the Beatles to do, well, he didn't force them. You can't force the Beatles to do anything, but he got the movie deals and like was pushing them into more movies. But yeah, he fucking hates actors.
Which makes me wonder because he says in the book that the reason he couldn't deal with being an actor and being in drama school was that he hated actors so much and he couldn't stand their personalities. And having been an actor who not quite on Broadway right now, I've heard that before. That people who don't quite get successful, they say, well, I just hated the people and I couldn't deal with the people. People say that. But we don't have actual evidence of him performing. We don't know what he was actually like. And I do wonder, given his theatricality and what he was able to do to, make the Beatles so successful, maybe he was better than we think he is. What we think of him as an actor is really just brought on by stories that he failed at so many things. But I do wonder if this is honest from his perspective and that he really couldn't stand the people.
That's very funny. I never thought of it like that, where it's like, okay, Brian, is that true? Or just not like, were you not a great actor? I don't know. I'm just saying. God, I wish somebody had like a tape. Hey, people who live around RADA and had old family members that went to RADA, can you just snoop around in like your grandparents' drawers and shit and see if you have any like 16 millimeter tapes of Brian acting? I'm just saying there might be
God.
something. Lovely. But it's funny because he also says like he hates actors, but he also says like as of 1959, he quote unquote was shy of stars and anxious not to be a bore in their dressing rooms. And that was like all of his friends who were actors. He'd still go see their plays and things, but he didn't love hanging around the dressing rooms because he was worried he'd be boring.
If you're an introvert in a world of extroverts, it is kind of intimidating to be in those spaces sometimes. I can see where you'd say that.
I bet.
And he was in those spaces constantly. It must have been a lot of dealing with that social anxiety feeling.
Definitely. Whereas music, it's like people are it's a different kind of weirdo in that music world. And then we, alluded to it before, but he also mentions a girlfriend. He said I forget what the context was, but he says, I was going somewhere with a girlfriend and then she broke up with me because of the Beatles. I'd rather go see them, whatever. And then later he says, the boys may marry one day, as may I, which, has been kind of, paraded around as a notable quote from this. But, so it's like, that's him sort of, again, like hiding his love away.
Oh God.
God, I hate myself. But hiding his true sexuality.
I mean, that wasn't uncommon either. For fuck's sake, Elton John got married in the 80s.
Right? Yeah, exactly. So many people, Rock Hudson, like Hollywood, music. And it sucks because I still hear, and we all still hear that there are so many, closeted male actors today. And like, for lack of a better example, Kevin Spacey, who came out in such a disastrous fucking way. Like,
my God.
F him. But, it's like, it still goes on, where they can't come out or they feel like they can't come out.
Yeah, and the concept of being gay as an identity wasn't quite as fleshed out as it is now anyway. So even if you didn't feel anything for women, you might still feel like you might get married someday anyway.
Right. Yeah. I mean, surprisingly, I could see, well, Queenie was aware. Queenie sort of always knew. But I could see if she maybe wasn't aware, she would definitely be pushing him into finding a wife.
And if not her, then his father, most likely.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, I mean, although Brian couldn't settle on a job, I mean, could he ever settle on a woman? Probably not.
No.
Hypothetically.
The book then goes on to talking about his perspective on the Beatles from the managerial sides of things. So he talks about things that are probably never been talked of before in a public space before this book. So how they formed companies, Brian's concerns about things like promotional products or how to keep interest in them in America after they returned to England, things like that. So it was an interesting perspective on the Beatles because it wasn't necessarily about their success, but that kind of taking a step back from their success and how do I manage their success?
Right. It's funny 'cause, we've been talking at length about his sort of flightiness in settling in a career, but Rex Macon, who was the Epstein's neighbor and also had a law office next to NIMS in Whitechapel in Liverpool, was a friend of Brian's. And Brian went to Rex and was sort of like, told him about the Beatles and was really excited. And then Rex was sort of like, oh, okay, Brian, like, yeah, sure. You're going to do this for like 2 weeks and then quit this too, right? And Brian was so offended because he very strongly felt like his involvement with the Beatles would be forever, which is so crazy when you consider like his track record.
Oh,
I think
yeah,
Rex was totally within his boundaries to be like, okay, dude, sure.
absolutely. The fact that the Beatles stuck with Brian is amazing. It's just one of those other amazing things about the Beatles story that it gelled. This totally unexpected long shot thing was the one that gelled.
I know. And to be fair, he sort of did kind of like not he didn't try to quit the Beatles, but he sort of like went down that path a couple times. Like when he came back from shopping them around in London and kept getting doors shut in his face. He talks about how he met the boys at Lime Street Station and was like really sad, and they all went and had like a coffee or something and sat around, and he was sort of like, I don't know, boys, like maybe this isn't whatever. But they were the ones that were like, no, Brian, this is going to work, and he says they quote unquote gave him the strength and energy to keep going, which is really amazing because they had that symbiotic relationship where they weren't going to let him just fucking abandon them.
Maybe in some ways, and maybe I'm just projecting here, but the whole reason that he did any of these things was to find his community and find his tribe. And if he felt out of place in the army and he felt out of place in acting and he felt out of place in school and he quit all of those things because there was nobody in his mind who would have cared whether he continued or not, well, then he left it. But because he had these people who really, really cared that he didn't quit, he didn't.
I think that's totally true. I think it was very much like, I don't know how much you guys believe in, destiny or whatever, but I think this was sort of meant to be. And also, he probably didn't get the same acceptance. Like, I'm sure nobody in the army was like, oh, no, Brian, don't go, or,
Yeah.
or like his fellow actors, but here it's like, oh, no, no, Brian, you're not going anywhere. Like, you're going to sit your ass here and find us a record deal.
It mattered to them, so he felt accountable, probably for one of the first times in his life.
I agree. It's funny. We talked a little bit about it at the top of the episode, but he talks a lot about the sort of cliche Beatles legends that we hear. And some of them, to be honest, are kind of like, oh, that's fake. That didn't really happen. But they all sort of stem from this book, and they did happen, which is surprising. Like, one of the things is, when the Beatles show up in Brian's office to sign their contract, Paul's not there, and Brian's like, where's Paul? And George is like, oh, he's in the bath, and yeah, he'll be late but very clean or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's like, and I've always thought like, okay, yeah, right, that's just too like corny to actually have happened. But no, it comes from a cellar full of noise. Brian tells that story, and I believe Brian, so I guess it happened.
Yeah, or like when George Harrison said to George Martin after their first audition, and George Martin said, is there anything you don't like about what we did today? And George Harrison said, well, I don't like your tie. I mean, that's like,
Yeah.
that's famous Beatles lore that most people feel is apocryphal because it's ridiculous. But it comes from this primary source of Brian, who was in the room.
Yeah, exactly. And he also talks about Raymond Jones, who we talk a lot about. I think in our episode,
We do.
is that the episode we talk about Raymond Jones? Raymond Jones, for those of you who aren't familiar, is the name of the person who may or may not exist, who went into NIMS and wanted a copy of the Beatles, Tony Sheridan, My Bonnie, which made Brian be like, who are the Beatles? The rest is history. And so Brian supports this Raymond Jones myth. It might be, and there's so much to go into there. It's unreal. So go back and listen to our other episodes. But he does also talk about the first time he saw the word Beatle, which was on a poster advertising University Dance at New Brighton Tower. And he said he'd seen the Beatles hanging around NIMS, which I think is so funny to have that image in your head of like Brian like organizing shit behind the desk and those idiots like clowning around in their leather jackets and stuff, and they don't even know each other. and yet it's going to be this massive thing, and nobody knows.
Yeah, that's like one of those stories you'd put in the beginning of a movie, because also that the Beatles, they never bought anything. They would just listen
No.
over and over in the listening booths until they got the chords down, but they wouldn't buy stuff. So they were probably really annoying
Yeah.
to a manager like Brian.
And he also talks about the rumor that he bought all the copies of the first single, Love Me Do, to get it onto the charts, which is not true.
And he was not pleased with those rumors.
Oh, no, no. He was very upset, and it definitely attacked his integrity, and that was the most important thing for him. So he was pretty pissed.
Which is nice to see. I mean, it's nice to see that he comes out with real emotions about this stuff. He's not denying it for the sake of denying it. He actually feels the insult to his core, and he tells us.
Yeah, he kind of lets loose. He talks about when the Beatles first signed the contract. As we all know, he didn't sign it because he felt if they were unhappy with him as manager, they could leave at any time. Again, such integrity,
Mm-hmm.
And he says, about the Beatles and all of his artists, quote unquote, there is no room in our relationships for contract slavery, which is amazing. In an era where you have like Colonel Tom Parker, who is like leading Elvis around on like a leash,
Yeah, and the A&R men, they gave artists like 1 cent for every record sold. I mean, they've really got the short end of the stick. He did not want that kind of relationship with them.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing he didn't give a lot of time to was Pete Best.
He's like, let's just gloss over this real quick.
He did do the firing. This is where that story comes from. He says it did make him sick to do it, but it was at the Beatles' request, so he had to do it.
And it made him a very, very unpopular man in Liverpool. Obviously, the girls who are all Pete Forever, Ringo Never did not like Brian very much.
But, it worked out for the best, and as he spent very little time on it, I guess so will we.
All right, let's move on. He talked about the Beatles. I thought this was really interesting. He talked a lot about the Beatles' live experiences off stage, aka getting to and from the shows. And he went into crazy amounts of detail about precisely how they get in the cars, they sneak out the back of places, or they have all these sort of like options that they go through. He gave the name of the Beatles driver.
Yes.
Right, who is still working for them. I'm like, okay, well, this is pretty much a blueprint for Beatles fans. So just do these things after a Beatles show and you'll run into them.
Maybe not the smartest. It was certainly an interesting read.
Yeah.
But I would have waited until after Beatlemania died down just a little. I mean, maybe that was where his head was at, that he really thought that was gonna end, that there wasn't gonna be that anymore. And he didn't ever think that the craziness of 1964 would lead to the anger and violence of 1965 and 1966 that led them to stop touring.
Yeah, I mean, Brian was very proud that there had been no violence under his watch, even though he talks about how the police undervalue the magnetism of McCartney or underestimate the determination of girls to tear at his clothes. And that's funny that he singles out Paul right there.
But it does beg the question, I mean, what would these girls do? Possessed with this passion that Brian literally called murderous, what would they do if they succeeded? And was Brian worried about this? And if Brian was worried about this, why is he talking about it?
I mean, that's a very good question. It's sort of like, a dog chasing a car. It's like the dog wouldn't know what to do if he caught the car. Who knows, like 1,000 screaming teenage girls, that could be detrimental, as we would see later in the decade.
And it already started. I mean, he mentions the jelly babies and the pointy things that got thrown on stage. Something almost got Paul in the eye.
Yeah.
He says, he's proud of no actual bodily harm or violence, but they were still at the point where there were some close calls.
Actually, thinking back, it's surprising that more crazy shit didn't go down. Like, they really did get lucky.
I don't know what the, reading statistics were on this book. Maybe actual teenagers felt that this book was a little adult and didn't read it. I don't know, but if I was an obsessed teenager and I got this, I'd be doing the work.
Oh, yeah. I would be like, oh, okay. Brian Epstein is talking directly to me and giving me coded ways to meet his boys. That would be, yeah. Or some crazy teenager might think of it that way.
Someone, not... Yeah.
Someone, yeah. Anyways, moving on. He does talk about each Beatle individually. He says he doesn't have a favorite.
Liar.
Jan.
Liar.
Yeah,
liar,
yeah.
Liar.
Right. Oh my God, okay. So I loved how he talked about Paul. It's so funny to me because Paul to casual fans or to whoever, they're like, oh, he's the cute one. He writes all the love songs. He's so sweet and like fluffy and like, just all these like saccharine, adjectives to describe Paul. But Brian gets it right on the head. Paul was an angry dude. He was like a bottle of energy that he just like could not, a bottle of creative energy, which made him very temperamental. He was moody, difficult to deal with. All of this stuff Brian says about Paul. It's funny thinking more down the line, and we talk about this in our episode about the weekend or the months leading up to Brian's death, and Paul leading Brian on, like jerking him around about the status of Brian's employment with the Beatles, and then at one point Paul didn't show up at a party that Brian was throwing that he said he would come to, and Brian was just so distressed, and the whole night he was sort of like, I wish Paul had come, I wish Paul had come. And so this far back, like 3 years back before that, it's so interesting to see Brian saying this about Paul in that context.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Paul being calculating and shrewd, it's all right here in 23-year-old Paul or whatever it was then. And really, he got all four Beatles pretty much on. I mean, whoever they were in 1963, 1964 is who they seem to be and seem to still be for the two that still remain. I mean, Ringo, I think he was especially interesting because he laid it out that he was not interested in having him in the band.
Yeah.
He said, I thought his drumming rather loud and his appearance unimpressive, and I could not see why he was important to the Beatles. He later said, I cannot pretend that facially Ringo seemed to me to be the perfect fit.
He thinks he's ugly.
Yeah, he wasn't into him. He didn't think he was great, but he concedes that he actually was a great choice. He's become a great Beatle. He was a devoted friend. He says he is warm and wry-witted, a good drummer, and I like him enormously. He's a very uncomplicated, very nice young man.
Which, to be fair, is the role that Ringo really served in the Beatles. I think Brian nails it with Ringo for sure.
Same with George, too. I mean, he described George as the most business-minded and frugal of the group. It's no surprise, really, that he went on to write songs like Taxman and Piggies. He also said that George showed a genuine interest in the outside world, so perhaps a precursor to his spirituality, even though he was only, 21 at that time.
And I almost wonder, and I need to maybe reread Tune In again, but like, where did George get this preoccupation with money? Because his whole life, he was just like fixated on taxes and like how he could like not cheat the system, but how he could like keep the most of his money and the whole concept of like giving the government his hard-earned money. And if he was obsessed with it when he was 21, what happened in childhood that made him so crazy fixated on this?
He was the only one of the four that came from a large family, and maybe things were just very tight. You know, his father was a bus driver, so it could be that he just learned the value of a dollar extremely fast.
That's true. That's true. I mean, it's surprising that maybe Ringo didn't have that same mindset, because I think Ringo was probably the poorest of the four.
He was also the sickest, though. I think he wasn't really concerned with practical things in the same way, because he had so much time convalescing as a kid.
That's probably right. And, you know, John and Paul, they were fine.
Yeah.
And speaking of John, of course, no surprise here that Brian devotes the most pages and words to how he feels about John. And he really kind of gushes about John. He says, had there been no Beatles and no Epstein participation, John would have emerged from the mass of the population as a man to reckon with. He may not have been a singer or a guitarist, a writer or a painter, but he would have most certainly have been a capital S something. You cannot contain a talent like this.
Yeah, he didn't have any favorites.
Yeah, no favorite though. No favorite though.
He did detail some of the cruelty at John's hand and at John's words, but he seemed to have a deeper view of that. He seemed to see beneath the insults and have kind of an understanding of who John was under the surface, which is, it's big of him to see that, especially if he was the one on being targeted at times with the cruelty.
I think maybe that goes back to what we were saying in the beginning where, you know, he might have seen bullying ultimately as a character builder and been like, oh yeah, I've seen this before. John is hurting. And they're both very damaged people, John and Brian. So I'm sure they recognize that with each other. And they did have a very close bond, whether or not you believe like they hooked up or whatever. They were very close, the two of them. But no favorite.
Nope. Another interesting thing he talks about is something that generates a lot of controversy when talking about Brian and the business of the Beatles, was his views on merchandising.
Mm.
Which is one thing that people say that if anything that Brian did not do well, it was getting a good cut of the Beatles and all of the merchandising deals that were coming through at the height of Beatlemania.
Yeah, that's the thing that we encounter most often about Brian. But he had a very profound quote in the book, and it's quote unquote, all of us learned a solemn lesson when the Davy Crockett Vogue died overnight, leaving frenzied wholesalers gazing in despair at hundreds of thousands of unschooled coonskin hats, which, yes, is a very short-sighted view of merch, but that's what it was. We have talked about it before at length, but there was really no merchandising. There was Elvis and there were movie stars merch, but it really wasn't the same as people clamoring to make Beatle wigs and guitars and dresses and all this kind of stuff that we're going to talk about at the Ridge next week. But that had never been done before.
And if you think about it, it was really only the dawn of any sort of culture of consumption, which started with a post-war period. But, if you think about things, physical things in the idea, and how long will they last? Can you repurpose them? Beatle wigs and Beatle bubble bath, they're not going to go anywhere if the Beatles tank.
Yeah. And when you're thinking about this 50s going into the 60s as a music business, what is it? It's mostly singles. And how many of those artists are one-hit wonders? A lot of them. We wouldn't have any sort of structure like the future until the Beatles, because that was when albums really started to come into play and create a lasting legacy. And of course, the Beatles were much more than that. But with the precursor, it's sort of like, why would you invest that much time and money into merchandise for maybe a singles artist who was going to have a hit called I Want to Hold Your Hand and then go away forever?
Even then, I mean, as much as you could see the musical talent of the Beatles, they were still putting out things that were very much in the mainstream pop milieu. They were not going experimental yet. There was no indication, even to the Beatles themselves, that they would be around more than 2 or 3 years.
Exactly. They all had plans for what to do when this thing dried up.
And that was super, successful for them. I mean, there's nothing bad about the fact that they might die out in 2 or 3 years. Nothing like the Beatles had ever been seen before. Maybe Frank Sinatra, but not even close to that level.
I mean, definitely nobody was selling Frank Sinatra bubble bath.
No.
And if I'm wrong about that, I would be so happy because that would be just the best.
What does it smell like? Like steak and cigars?
Oh my God, it smells like Palm Springs on a real hot day.
Ew. That's why they didn't sell it.
And it's blue because blue eyes.
Mm.
And it comes with a martini that you can drink in the bath.
All right. Well, you're going to be seeing our GoFundMe for this product any day now. Be sure to pitch in.
Frank Sinatra bubble bath. Yeah.
Gross.
Anyway, back to Brian.
Yes.
More importantly.
Another thing that might have made him short-sighted was he described throughout his commitment to only working with the highest quality people, with the most honest, most expert professionals that he could find. He described how he felt that as newcomers to the scene, he had to be very sharp-minded about this because he was vulnerable. And so he felt that there were a lot of sleazy people in the business. And as he said, we have created a team which is incorruptible, powerful, and which has a sense of direction and purpose. Could this be the one place where Brian's obsession with working with the highest of quality made him blind to the potential success in this area because the merchandise is inherently ephemeral and mostly cheap?
That's quite possible. And, I could see anybody giving him advice. It's sort of like, oh yeah, don't fuck with that. Like, let's just focus on the stuff that we already know how to do. So obviously, besides the Beatles, Brian worked with a lot of other artists. He talks about our girl, Miss Cilla Black, who we love very much.
He.
Yes, exactly. He talks very lovingly. He calls her my lovely Cilla. And he talks about basically how he was sort of obsessed with her from the second time he saw her. The first time she sort of choked, but the second time he got a real sense of who she was as a performer.
And this can all be seen in the dramatized ITV movie called Cilla, which you can find on YouTube or on Acorn TV, which we love and would happily watch with you if you wanted to.
Exactly. We watch it pretty much every time we're together, some sort of fashion. I like part 2 because that's most Brian. It's all very good. We love it.
I like part 1 because her hair is cuter in part 1.
Oh my gosh, her hair is so cute and it's so great. And that's it. It's funny because Brian talks about how he didn't want to sign another girl singer because he didn't want to dilute Scylla's quote unquote special attention. And he says something kind of misogynistic. He's like, oh, there's only so much room on the charts for girl singers.
Yeah.
Brian.
I mean, I think in the day that was kind of the way it was. It was probably another 3 or 4 years where, we finally got some amazing women more of the folk rock world. But if you weren't in Motown, there weren't a lot of girl singers.
I mean, you had the Ronettes, obviously. You had some of the girl groups out of New York, Shangri-Las, and that. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's true, especially coming out of England. I mean, there were some more in the theatrical realm, certainly Helen Shapiro and those guys. But yeah, I guess it was pretty limited.
I'm glad they saw the special talent in Scylla and brought it out because that
Yeah.
that was certainly foresight on his part.
Exactly. She's the best. And he says that she's one of the very great stars of the future, the most photographed girl in England, the singer everyone loves and admires, but whom no one envies because of her utter simplicity, which backhanded a little bit.
Backhanded, but totally astute. In the same way he describes Ringo and Ringo's charm, he describes Scylla's charm, and exactly, I think he encapsulates it.
That is true, because she's sort of like the girl next door.
She's very plain spoken. She's very sure of herself. She's cute. She doesn't ooze sexuality in any way. And I think that's what made her, the England's most beloved TV persona for the next 40 years after Brian's death or so.
That's true.
So good job, Brian. Prescient. Now, as we get toward the end of the book, unlike a lot of publicity pieces about music scene or entertainers, Brian was very candid and took a lot of time describing the strain of Beatlemania. He devoted a whole chapter to the subject at the end. He started the chapter off in a very funny way. He said, I don't know if it was Shakespeare or Ringo Starr who said, when this business stops being fun, I'm giving it up. But whoever it was, I know what he meant, and there was a time early this year when I almost gave it up. First of all, Shakespeare, Ringo, I think that was Ringo. But
that's the hunch I had.
Very cute. Very cute.
It is cute. That was very tongue-in-cheek of him.
Yes. But he does detail a story where he talks about how the strain of Beatlemania was getting so great that he got an offer to sell off half of his company for £150,000, which would be about $1.5 million US today, to still have final say in decisions over the Beatles, but much less involvement.
And again, it was the Beatles' loyalty to him. He was very forthcoming, went to them and said, hey, I have this offer. What do you think? Just to get their feedback. And they were very negative. They did not want him to do it at all. And that's really what made him stay, was their loyalty to him.
I do wonder what had happened if he had decided to sell.
I mean, it's hard to imagine it because I don't think he would have ever done it. But I think also part of it was probably like, dude, nobody believed in me. Nobody believed in these boys for so many years. And now they're successful. Go F yourself. I don't know. It probably would have been kind of like what happened towards the end of the Beatles' career, where it was just like it became this sort of monstrous conglomeration that kind of stalled. They probably wouldn't have had as long of a career without Brian.
Definitely. I mean, Brian would have had a lot of the same say, but he probably wouldn't have had as much pull because it sounded like the Beatles were somewhat offended by the idea of selling. So maybe they would have not listened to his advice quite as eagerly had he sold.
Yeah, because that's kind of underhanded, to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to, sell off half of my stock in the Beatles or whatever. Like that would have negated everything he stood for up till that point.
But he chose not to do it, and just like in the earlier days where he wasn't getting bite from the record companies and the Beatles persuaded him that he had to stay, he stayed. But he's still 3 years in pretty candid about the pressure and that even with the great success, he was pretty much driving himself crazy with the anxiety. You can really imagine what it must have been like for him 3 years later when he started feeling like actually the band didn't need him or didn't want him anymore.
Yeah, especially when he's thinking earlier in the book, he's talking about how he sees his permanent future with the Beatles. And I don't think he could ever foresee, a time when they didn't really need him, but he was confronted with that, obviously, and tragically died before anything could come or not come of it. But yeah, he is very upfront about the pressures and the stresses because this is, again, the first time this sort of, operation has ever really been done. And there's really no blueprint for him to follow. So he's just working himself to the bone because that's what he thinks is necessary.
Yeah, and the only experience in pop music is that these acts come and go immediately. So there's probably great pressure on him. Every day the Beatles last longer. How are you doing it? How are you going to sustain it? What's going to happen when you get back to England? So he doesn't even have time to really plan out the future. He is just always being asked these anxiety provoking questions.
And, he's got people scrutinizing the way he's running the business. And it's just stress on all sides. But he does end on a very upbeat note. He ends the book hopeful. And, he talks about wanting to get them more films, which indeed he did. We talk about that in our Yellow Submarine episode about his 3-picture deal with United Artists that they had to fulfill after his death. And he has a really funny quote in the final chapter where he says, audience response is their only stimulant drug.
Yeah.
Sure, Jan. No.
I love the lie. It's a wonderful, beautiful, innocent, pure lie.
Aw, Brian, that's not the case.
Yeah, you like the stimulants too, Sash.
Some boy's been on Prellies since like Hamburg and before.
Right?
They love their speed.
Yeah. So there are a few places I feel like he's brutally honest unless it threatens the safety and security of either him or his boys.
Right. Or their overall image. Because if you would have been like, oh yeah, the Beatles were pill poppers, that would have been like down the toilet, like the whole career.
Would have been a much more popular book.
That's true. Yeah, he's not salacious. Again, like if he's talking shit about people, he never names names, which is so disappointing. But it's not super salacious. He does say, I believe there are only 2 worthwhile routes in show business, up or out. And, it makes you think, like, what would he actually do if any of his artistes started changing or fizzling out? Tommy quickly did. Tommy quickly was kind of a disaster, but he was sort of swept under the rug kind of quickly. Brian lost interest and quietly dropped him. But he never certainly had the profile of the Beatles or Cilla or Billy J or Jerry, any of those other bigger acts.
He was confronting this a few years later in that the Beatles were branching off without him. Cilla didn't make quite the splash that he thought she would in America, so he was trying to find a different way for her. And, a lot of his British invasion bands were more 1 or 2 hit wonders in the States, even though the Beatles went so far.
I think he always saw value in most of his artists anyway. But I think also he took a lot of direction from the artists themselves. I'm thinking about Billy J, who, for lack of a better word, sort of retired after, he didn't retire. He sort of slowed down his music making. And then he also became a TV presenter, later in the 70s. Mm-hmm. But I think maybe that was sort of led by Billy and Brian not being like, oh, you have to do, record Lennon McCartney hits or, whatever.
Yeah, he told a similar story about Cilla. I think that he was out in America with her and they went out with an agent or producer or something. And the guy took Brian aside and told him he thought that Cilla, he should work with her to reform her image, that she seemed too common, too low class. And he said, absolutely not. She is who she is and she's going to be that. And I'm not going to let any pressures of the industry form her into anything else.
Yeah, he also, in this last chapter, addresses his own character. And this is particularly profound. He says, I don't mind people delving deep into me, searching for reasons and secrets, because there is nothing too bad there. Even if there were something to be ashamed of, if it were true and if it were known and if it were published, I could not complain. I am extremely fond of the truth, and I wish that I could find it as often as I find the reverse in my day-by-day contacts with people. That's a very loaded couple of sentences there.
In light of what we know now, if he had written that today, he would have been right. Because there's absolutely nothing wrong with who he was. But unfortunately, in 1964, who he was a crime. And he had to hide it. And somehow, whether it was all out lies or whether it was a compartmentalization that he was just really good at, he was able to kind of carve out that part of his life that was not permitted by society at the time and be able to, feel that he was telling the truth in this statement. I think I don't feel like I feel like there was a part of him that believed this.
Well, I think how he handled his homosexuality was true for him because it's how it had to be handled. He really had no alternative. He couldn't be openly gay.
Hmm.
So the fact that, he was hiding that part of himself, it's just common sense. Like, yes, of course. Like, I am a true person. This is how I have to handle this. So not so much lying, but just how it had to be.
And that's just so unfortunate.
Yeah, it is. But I think also he was for the people who were closest to him, they all knew. And really, it was nobody else's business. So I could see him also taking that stance where it's like, yeah, it sucks. Like I have to hide this part of myself, but it really has nothing to do with my professional life. And it's, yeah, nobody's business but my own.
It's a real shame that I think homosexuality was decriminalized in the UK either weeks before or weeks after he died. So
Yeah,
he
right.
was right there. He just missed being able to know what it was like to be able to at least, if not live openly, live without the pressure of being arrested on his back.
Right. It's very sad.
To close out this book, his final words were pretty powerful and they were optimistic and, like so many other things, quite sad given what happened to him a few years later. He says, however much I socialize with the great and famous, I would prefer a quiet afternoon with George Martin and Judy, George Martin's wife, making a bob or two at Lingfield Park races. And best of all, and far beyond anything money can buy, I love to lean on my elbows at the back of the stalls and watch the curtain rise on John, Paul, George, and Ringo, Jerry, Billy, Tommy, Michael, or the wonderful songbird daughter of a Liverpool docker, and christened Priscilla Maria Veronica White, who will stun the world as Cilla Black. Tomorrow, I think the sun will shine tomorrow.
Aw, I love that. It reminds me of when Paul talks about Brian leaning in the back of the stalls with his polka dot scarf, being very proud of his boys.
Yeah.
And there's video footage of that, and it's just so lovely. And oh,
I really do think that he was optimistic about life, and I think that mental illness and the pressures of hiding who you are and the pressures of his job, which were huge, they took a toll on him, but he did have an optimistic nature.
and he had a lot of reasons at this point to be very, very positive about that. I love that. I love the conclusion. I love the book. We've been talking about our feels about this book the whole time, but it really is such a must read for anybody who's even remotely interested in the Beatles because it's a different perspective, gives you more of a background, more of a foundation. It's just wonderful, to dig inside the mind of Brian a little bit.
It's so fun in a way to really hear, what was going on behind the scenes. I mean, not only how they developed their getaway car system, but what Brian was thinking about managing them as they rocketed to this unprecedented stardom. It's nice to hear Brian's thoughts on everything. Not only the Beatles, but, his snarky thoughts about all the people in his society. It was really funny.
I think it's a cool redemptive story too, which proves it's not like this person who I said had a wonderful upbringing, in a very privileged household with great parents and a brother, how he sort of like did not know what to do with himself and he failed a million times at a million different things. And yet he went on to become this incredible impresario who brought all this music, the Beatles to the world. Is there a bigger band? There's not. He really achieved the ultimate professional success. That's really inspiring because I mean, I know for me, being a bit of a perfectionist type A person, it's like when I fail at something, I hate it. I
Mm-hmm.
hate to fail.
Yeah.
But then it's sort of like, I feel like Brian was kind of like that too. And, it's inspiring that even though he failed a million times, he finally landed on what he's supposed to do with his life.
One thing that comes out of this book is that he really needs to be celebrated for his courage.
Yeah.
Not all this trying different things, and he finally happened upon something, and the courage to be out there and to try something that has never been tried before and have this crazy success and to keep on working at it. And it's really inspiring.
Yeah, it's inspiring. What else can you say? Also, it's a primary source, as we talked about, for a lot of the well-known Beatles stories. It's unfortunate this thing's out of print. I mean, my copy is, I think, from 1998, and it has an intro by Martin Lewis, which is I skipped entirely because it's probably not incredibly factual. I'm going to be
Mm,
very, graceful with this, but yeah,
right.
it's 1998. Actually, it's published by Rhino Rediscovery.
Yeah, I noticed it was a Rhino publication, and I also noticed that you work for Rhino, so I was wondering if there's anything we can do about that.
Oh, trust me, I took this book in like my second day and I'm like, what's up with this? Can we republish this and can I write the intro? And they're like, yeah, we don't do that anymore.
Ah,
So very sad, but very cool though that they did that at one point.
yes.
Yeah, I mean, I really do wish though it would have another publishing. It's about time. It's been over 20 years. So
If nothing else, it's on Kindle, and it's like $5. So
there you go.
it's easy to get, and it's a pretty quick read. It's a very interesting read, and even though you know a lot of these stories, it's worth a read just because it is the primary source.
It was so nice to read it again. So glad we did it for book club.
Yeah, so if you've read this book and you have questions, we'd love to keep talking about it. So send us questions on any of our socials. Email us, bcthebeatles@gmail.com, and let's continue the conversation.
Yeah, tweeted us, all that good stuff. Now, let's move on to one of our favorite segments that we do in our episodes, our current Beatles obsession, Erica.
Yes. So even though we're going to Beatles at the Ridge this weekend, there's another Beatles festival that I'm really excited about. This Saturday, September 21st, in Westport, Massachusetts, there's a one-day Beatles festival called Harrafest, which is dedicated only to George, which I was really excited about because I've never heard of a festival dedicated only to George before.
It's about damn time.
Yeah, we don't talk about George enough. I think we've got to do a George
talk about
episode
George
real
more.
soon.
I agree.
Yeah, so One Day Festival, sponsored by both a pizza joint and a cannabis dispensary. It's legal in Massachusetts, so let's just say it's guaranteed to be a fun time. I think George would approve.
Yeah, I think so.
Also, shout out to the friend who told me about this, my friend way back from high school, Dave Loria, who's got a band, who's a George tribute band called By George, is playing at Harrafest. They're great. I'll play them out at the end of the episode, one of their songs. He and a whole bunch of other bands are playing, so if you're up in the New England area and can get down to Westport, Mass, pretty central, take a day and celebrate the wonderful George Harrison. Tickets at harrafest.com.
Now, does your friend dress up like George?
No, it's a women and men. It's a cover band, not a tribute band. They recreate the songs amazingly. They do the harmonies so well, but they don't do anything to try and look or, dress up like George.
Okay. I mean, one of the women maybe should dress up like George.
That would be interesting.
Maybe they could all be different Georges of different periods of George.
I told him that if I was ever in town, I'm going to sing harmony in his band. So I called George in his perm years.
Yeah. Oh my God. Perm George.
I love perm George.
Oh Lord. We should just do a perm George episode because that perm.
1973 perm George. So good. So good.
Oh, George. I mean, he could pull off the curls, but damn, those were some tight perm curls.
Oh, it was a big head of hair. Like Brian May is the only other head of hair I can think of that had curls like that. Though his thing might be natural.
Yeah, exactly. George, definitely not. Definitely not.
As much as I want to keep talking about the perm, what were you obsessed with this week?
Oh my God. Well, my obsession this week goes along with the theme of book club, which it's to do with Brian. Big fucking surprise. Allison's thing has to do with Brian. But this is like not an amazing obsession. It's more like I was creeped out beyond belief. So as we were working on the mini-sode about how to pronounce Brian's last name, I spent many, many hours going down the YouTube rabbit hole. And it had been a minute since I Googled Brian's stuff. And, so it pulled up a bunch of interviews I hadn't seen before, which was awesome. It was so cool to have new stuff to look at. But it also pulled up some really weird stuff.
Yeah, like what?
So there are two videos. There's one of, oh my God, it's a long video. I didn't watch it all because I just could not. These two videos are paranormal people who claim to either channel Brian or to, like, what do you call it when you sort of become Brian, like Brian's spirit comes into you and you talk
I
like
think
Brian.
That's channeling.
He manifests.
I think that's channeling.
Oh, that's channeling? So the other thing is like Brian EVP recorded.
Like medium. You're either a medium and you're connecting with the spirit, or if you're a channel, I think that's when you like talk like them.
Okay. Well, there's one of those, and then there's like one with like an EVP recorder
Ugh.
where he's claiming to talk to Brian. And I just was so offended watching these fucking videos. The one where this guy channels Brian is like an hour long. And it is so offensive. Thank God he's not trying to do like a very posh accent. He's just talking like himself, but he's answering as Brian, and all of his answers are so bogus. It's generic shit. Like he gets asked, like, what's your favorite Beatles song? And I think he's like, oh, I love all of the songs of the Beatles, like blah blah blah. And it's like I just can't. I can't.
Oh my God.
I get really upset when I talk about this. And the other one, the EVP guy, it's a shorter video, but he has the box thing that they use to like measure energy, and then he plays the EVP recording, and he apparently has like Brian saying help, or the guy asks, are John and George with you on the other side, and he says something like it's okay here or something. Of course, it's not real. It's definitely, I mean, unless you believe in that kind of thing, but it's like, I don't know. It's indignant, and I don't like it.
That is messed up. You sent me those videos, and I just was not able to watch. It freaks me out. But
I know. And here's the thing: they've both been posted in the last like month.
Really?
Like maybe I think one is from late July, and the other one was right around Brian's anniversary of his death. And I'm like, what the fuck is happening where people are all of a sudden being like all paranormally with Brian? Like, leave him the F alone. Leave Brian alone.
That is messed up.
So obsession in that I can't forget it. Like I can't unsee or unhear those videos. Let's all report them to YouTube and make them take it down.
Yeah, this is less of a recommendation and more like an oh my God.
Yeah, pretty much. OMG, I can't believe this is a thing that exists.
Oh.
Anyways, so that's where I am in my life.
Well, on that note,
bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to BC the Beatles. And as always, please subscribe on iTunes, Apple Podcast, or wherever you're listening right now, and give us a rating and review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll be posting photos and more from this episode and beyond, but not those creepy videos. Nope. You're on your own.
Nope.
And remember, you can always email us at bcthebeatles.com too. We'll see you at the Ridge this weekend if you're going.
Yep.
What? You should. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Next time.
Bye.
Sometimes I wish I knew you well. Then I would speak my mind and tell you. Maybe you'd understand. I want to tell you I feel hung up.